Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our April 20th Budget Subcommittee number 3 hearing. We'll begin by establishing a quorum.
Bloom.
Here.
Gordon.
Here.
Overnolte.
Here.
Patterson.
Here.
Williams.
And let's move right into the vote-only calendar. I would just make one announcement. Our last item, Issue 5, under ARB and OEHA, will not be taking that up today. So we have issues 1 through 4.
With that in mind, I would move issues 1, 2, and 3.
Second.
Let's vote.
Bloom.
Aye.
Overnolte.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Patterson. Williams.
And then I would move item number 4.
I'll second that. Let's vote.
Bloom.
Aye.
Overnolte.
No.
Gordon.
Aye.
Patterson.
No.
We'll hold that open for Mr. Williams' arrival. And let's begin our items to be heard. We start this morning with issues 1 and 2. We'll start with the Cap and Trade Annual Report. And just to set out some expectations, we're going to, don't go away, we're going to take public comment after issues 1 and 2. Good morning, how are you?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Matt Almy, Department of Finance. The first issue is a discussion about the Cap and Trade Annual Report. And the Department of Finance, in coordination with Air Resources Board and data input from all administering agencies, has recently released an annual report on cap and trade auction proceeds. This report was provided pursuant to AB 1532, which requires finance to submit an annual report on the status of projects funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and their outcomes. This legislative requirement was designed to create a framework of accountability and transparency for the cap and trade program, as well as establish a built-in mechanism for continuous learning. By reporting on the metrics for all cap and trade programs, each annual report helps to inform future budget proposals and the next 3-year investment plan. The annual report demonstrates the administration's commitment to the accountability and transparency goals of AB 1532. Key findings in the report include between March 2014 and December 2015, for purposes of implementing greenhouse gas emission reduction programs, $2.6 billion has been appropriated to agencies, $2.7 billion has been awarded to projects, $912 million in projects have been implemented. Over 2,500 projects have been implemented, and over 6,300 rebates, 63,000 rebates and vouchers have been issued. 14.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent of lifetime GHG reductions associated with these projects. And 51% of implemented funds provide benefits to disadvantaged communities before including high-speed rail. And 39% of implemented funds are for projects located within disadvantaged communities before including high-speed rail. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll proceed now to hear from LAO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, Ross Brown with the LAO. We've prepared a handout, actually, for this issue that the sergeant, I think, can pass around right now. And the handout is really based, it's our review of the administration's March report on the outcomes of spending so far from the Cap and Trade program. And the handout essentially summarizes some of the comments that we made in a recent analysis that we've done and an online post that we made. So there's no new information necessarily. If you want more detail, then you can reference that analysis, but this summarizes some of the key takeaways. So if you turn to page 1 of the handout, just some high-level numbers. The Department of Finance already covered some of the high-level numbers about the estimated greenhouse gas reductions associated with programs that have been funded so far. 14 million metric tons in greenhouse gas reductions, excluding high-speed rail. Important to note that those estimated reductions are over the lifetime of the different projects. So for many of these projects, there's pretty long lifetimes, in many cases decades long. So that number includes sort of over the lifetime, over a long period of time. Another important piece of information, I think, in the report is that the administration estimates that over half of the funding that has been awarded and implemented for projects has gone to projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. So if you turn to page 2 of the handout, we provided a table with some numbers that are based on the information, the spending information, and the greenhouse gas reduction estimates that are provided by the administration. And we do want to say that we think this report is an important sort of step forward in just the amount of information that's available for you in the legislature to help evaluate the outcomes of these different programs and what they're achieving so far. And we've taken the information that the administration has provided and put it into a table that illustrates for the different programs the estimated amount of greenhouse gas reduction money that has been spent per estimated unit of greenhouse gas reduction. And so a few key takeaways, I think, from this table and this information are, one, the clear sort of wide variation in the amount of money, state money that has gone to these projects and the estimated reduction per dollar spent. As you can see from the table, there's a wide variation in sort of the cost per ton figure that we've calculated based on the administration's estimates. The other key takeaway, I think, is just overall in the average across these different programs is about $57 in state spending per unit of greenhouse gas reduction. And I think one potential benchmark that the legislature might want to look at when sort of evaluating that number is the current market price for allowances, which is currently below $13. And so in theory, that market price is a reflection of sort of the marginal costs associated with additional emission reductions needed to meet the state's current GHG goals. And so these numbers here and the average costs for the spending programs is quite a bit higher than that number. Now, it's not a perfect comparison, but that's one benchmark I think that the legislature might want to keep in mind when thinking about how effective these programs are. If you turn to page 3 of your handout, we discussed some of the significant shortcomings associated with the information that's provided in the report. As we mentioned, we think it's a step forward, but we also advise caution in giving too much weight to some of the information that's in here, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is just some of our concerns about the accuracy of some of the greenhouse gas reduction estimates. For example, the estimates don't take into account interactions with some of the existing regulations, and we've written quite a bit about this issue in recent months about interaction between spending programs and the cap and trade regulation itself, and that with the cap and trade regulation in place, if the regulation and the number of allowances that are being issued by the ARB is really limiting the overall level of emissions from major sources of emissions, then spending money to reduce emissions from those same sources may not actually result in any sort of net reduction in overall emissions. It may simply free up allowances for other entities to use. And so we think that's an important interaction for the legislature to keep in mind as it thinks about the role of cap and trade spending and what's being accomplished by these different programs, and the administration's estimates don't take that into account. And I think another example that we point to regarding some of our concerns about the estimates is that for the most part they don't take into account what would have otherwise occurred in some of these activities. One example is rebates for electric vehicles, for example. The administration's estimates assume that anybody who's accessing one of these rebates would have otherwise purchased just an average conventional vehicle. There's no assumption that some of these people or households would have otherwise purchased the electric vehicle anyways, and there's some research out there that suggests a significant portion of the people probably would have purchased those vehicles anyways. And so by failing to take that factor into account, then some of the numbers might overstate some of the GHG reductions associated with the spending. The other key limitation we want to note is that there aren't any quantitative estimates of co-benefits. And when the legislature evaluates all of these different spending options, co-benefits might be a significant consideration for the legislature. And so without that type of quantitative information, then it makes it difficult to weigh the trade-offs associated with some of these different spending options if there isn't complete information on the co-benefits that would be achieved by the different programs. Page 4 of the handout goes into, just based on our findings, some of the considerations for the legislature. And the first one is just more of a big picture consideration, which is what is the role of cap and trade spending in the state achieving its long-term GHG goals. To what extent does the legislature want to rely on these spending programs to achieve its GHG goals in a cost-effective manner versus relying on other policies and other regulations, for example, relying more on the cap and trade regulation itself rather than the spending piece of it. And the second item, I think, for consideration is just really trying to ensure that the legislature gets good information to help evaluate all of the different programs and make spending decisions and allocate spending in a way that best achieves its priorities. And so some ways to do that may be to direct the administration to take some of these certain factors that I mentioned into account when providing estimates back to the legislature so it can have good information available to make those decisions. Another option that we've recommended is to consider establishing an expert committee that helps develop some of these estimates and ensure that the information that's coming back to the legislature is reliable and useful for your decision making. So I'll conclude my comments there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that this graph on page 2, this chart, is fascinating, the one that ranks the cost efficiency of various cap and trade spending. One thing that stood out to me about this, though, looking at the clean vehicle rebates, which is relatively high up on the chart in terms of efficiency, and comparing that to the truck and bus voucher initiatives, which are quite low on the chart, that surprised me because you'd expect that relationship to be inverted since buses and trucks drive so many miles. So why is that?
I think that gets into probably some of the estimating, some of the methods that they use to estimate, and I frankly sort of can't say exactly some of the details for the truck and bus voucher program. I do want to sort of note again on the clean vehicle rebate program, there is this issue of rebates going to purchases that maybe would have already happened, and so to the extent that's not being taken into account, then the cost per ton number looks maybe a little bit lower than it otherwise would have if that information is taken into account.
Sure, well, I understand that, but I mean, I'm sure the same assumption is being made for the truck and bus voucher initiatives as well, so I'm not sure that that factor is something that is influencing that relationship.
That's fair, sure, yeah.
All right, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Gordon? Great. All right. Thank you. Do we have any additional presentations? Well, thank you very much. Right. We're going to move on to issue number 2 now, cap and trade funding proposal. Now, just for the benefit of those listening in, issue number 1 is informational only. We have a recommendation on issue number 2 to hold open.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of issue number 2, there's the administration's cap and trade funding proposal. The governor's budget proposes a $3.1 billion cap and trade expenditure plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through programs that support clean transportation, sustainable communities, energy efficiency, and carbon sequestration and waste diversion. The framework for prioritizing the cap and trade expenditure plan was informed by 3 primary considerations. Number 1 was the state's broader climate strategy. The governor's budget prioritizes investments to support the state's broader climate strategy, including requirements established in legislation in the governor's recent executive order establishing a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Key climate change strategies include increasing electricity derived from renewable sources to 50%, reducing petroleum use in cars and trucks by up to 50%, doubling the rate of energy efficiency savings in existing buildings and making heating fuels cleaner, reducing the release of short-lived climate pollutants such as methane and black carbon, and increasing carbon sequestration on farms, in rangelands, and in forests and wetlands. The proposed expenditures in the budget align with these climate strategies. The second consideration was the 3-year investment plan. The budget proposal was informed by public comments received through 11 public meetings and workshops as part of the development of the cap-and-trade investment plan. For example, after listening to comments received at the public workshops encouraging greater local control, the budget proposes $100 million for a new transformational climate communities program to support local climate actions in the state's top 5% of disadvantaged communities. And third, a focus on benefits to disadvantaged communities. At least 30% of the cap-and-trade expenditures are proposed to benefit disadvantaged communities. The legislature will have an opportunity to evaluate all of the specific components of the cap-and-trade expenditure plan over the next few months. As the legislature considers the administration's proposal, I'd like to emphasize that the cap-and-trade expenditure plan should not be viewed as a listing of standalone, separate programs, but as a balanced portfolio of investments and a cohesive package of integrated programs that is designed to achieve both immediate short-term emission reductions and long-term transformational changes necessary to reduce the ongoing risk of climate change. Thank you.
Leo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few comments. I think the first comment is just on the revenue side, and I know your agenda notes and provides some comments on revenue for this year and expected revenue in future years. And I just want to note that our revenue projections are generally similar to the administration's, which projects $2.4 billion in cap-and-trade revenue in the current year, and the administration projects or assumes $2 billion in revenue in the budget year. Our budget year estimate is a few $100 million higher, but generally in the same range. I think it is important to keep in mind that there's significant uncertainty around these revenue estimates, both on the high end as well as on the low end. And the agenda lays out just the one factor, which is the number of allowances that are likely to be sold by the ARB in future years, and that's declining, and it makes sense as the cap is declining as well. But a key factor is really sort of the price of those allowances and what the price of those allowances is sell. And there's some potential that that price increases in the future. There's also some potential that some of the allowances don't actually sell in the future. And there's some of the recent information, for example, the most recent cap-and-trade auction in February, not all of the allowances sold. So we just want to put that on your radar as an area of uncertainty about sort of future cap-and-trade revenue. As far as the administration's expenditure plan, some of our key points, I think, are first, the Department of Finance mentioned the investment plan, and that's the basis, that being the basis for the administration's proposal this year. In our view, the investment plan lacks a really robust analysis of the types of programs that really achieve the state's goals most effectively, and a really robust sort of framework for spending. The plan identifies different types of programs that could potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in our view, it doesn't provide a clear analytical justification for why spending auction revenues on each program is likely to achieve the state priorities most effectively. For example, the plan doesn't include, again, sort of back to the issue of the interactions with existing regulations and where the spending fits in the context of all of the other regulations and programs that the state has to achieve its GHG goals. And we feel like that's a very important consideration to keep in mind when thinking about how to use this money to promote the state's priorities most effectively, particularly within the context of the cap-and-trade regulation and some of the interactions that occur there. In addition, for the specific proposals that are part of this year's budget, certain proposals lack a lot of detail. For example, the transformational climate communities proposal, there's not a lot of detail on what projects exactly will be funded, and so that's just, we think those programs might have significant merit, but it's difficult to evaluate and know sort of what those outcomes will be without some more detail on what those programs will look like and the projects that will be funded. And then finally, the expected benefits of the proposals oftentimes are unclear, and this goes back to just sort of the challenges and difficulties associated with estimating both the greenhouse gas benefits as well as some of the other co-benefits associated with many of the different programs. The March report helps provide some more information about the programs that have been funded so far, but for the new programs, oftentimes there's limited information about what would be achieved, or we have concerns about the estimates that are provided. So our recommendations are to continue to direct the administration to provide more robust estimates of benefits and help facilitate and encourage a more robust investment plan, just essentially more analysis and better analysis and estimates regarding how to think about cap and trade spending in the context of the state's broader regulatory programs and the cap and trade program in particular, and encourage just better estimates and better analysis regarding the different programs and the degree to which they help achieve different state priorities. And again, back to the issue of perhaps relying on an expert committee to help ensure that information that's coming back to you is reliable and useful, and you're getting the type of information that can help you prioritize amongst all of these different programs that are being proposed. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I wonder if both of you could address a little bit more the information that's on pages 10 and 11 of the agenda relating to declining revenue between now and the out years of the budget. There's a concern expressed in the agenda that by funding multi-year programs, we're going to end up with a shortfall very quickly for those programs, and that seems like a matter of very serious concern to me. So I'm wondering if each of you could address that.
I think that we don't necessarily have, as the LAO mentioned, revenues for cap and trade are very uncertain, and so we don't necessarily have an out-year projection of what the revenue would be. But the basic point that the agenda makes, which is that given the declining cap, all things being equal, you would expect revenues would be lower in the out years than it is now, is a fair point. What I would say is that in terms of the administration's proposal, it is true that the budget proposal is proposing primarily one-time expenditures. The exception is the transportation proposal, which aligns with the transportation package, which is $500 million, which is being proposed as ongoing. What I would say is that in most cases these are grant programs, and similar to, say, bond funds that also have grant programs, it is acceptable to provide one-time money for grant programs. And to the extent that there are some ongoing programs related to, say, rebates, those would have to be evaluated in the out years.
So I think the question that's raised is there are a number of proposals that would start what are essentially new programs, or at least newly funded programs by the within the budget. And if these are programs that we anticipate will have ongoing needs and we're going to have declining revenue, then we're kind of putting ourselves in the position of setting these programs up for a short-term funding when they would naturally demand otherwise.
Yes, but that's a fair point. I guess the counter is that there's a lot of bond funds that are established kind of on a one-time basis. Bond funds aren't ongoing, and they're established for grant programs. And the key is to fund highly valued projects, and then as we do the annual report, that provides kind of continuous evaluation of which of those programs are worth continuing and which aren't.
LAO?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point, and sort of asking the question about sort of on an ongoing basis, which of these programs are sort of structured in a way that that sort of need ongoing funding, and I think that's an important consideration to think about when you're thinking about this year's package and the extent to which you want to rely on or use the money for programs that are already sort of up and running, and maybe you can use those monies for those programs or establishing new programs, because I think the revenue issue and the resource issue is particularly acute this year, given that a lot of the money that's being raised this year wasn't allocated in last year's budget. And so you have a lot of money potentially available to spend this year, but that's not necessarily reflective of, of what's going to be available in the future. And so, making those types of decisions, and I think that's an important consideration.
Thank you. And I'm frankly not sure what the answer is, but I think that we need to be thinking about the reality that we face, not just this year, but in the out years, as we allocate these, what in reality are very scarce funds. Mr. Williams.
I guess I wonder how you jive that with that concern versus your table on page 2, which indicates your cost per ton of the different kinds of reductions. Well, the things that are most efficient there, in some cases by a factor of 200 times more efficient, meaning can get 200 times more GHG reduction per dollar, are things that are new proposed programs by the administration that will only need to be funded, in some cases, one time, meaning they would be effective. They would be even more effective if you had more than 1 year of funding, but would be effective even if you just only had 1 year of funding. The most efficient uses on that table are organics and solid waste related expenditures. That's proposed by the administration, and that is grants that can be used on one time, because most of that is going to to get anaerobic digestion facilities going, or dairy digesters or other things. So, if I looked at this table, I would go, well, then we should be funding those things because they're between 50 and 100 times more efficient with our money.
Yeah, and I think just one thing to note is that those programs on the table, have been funded already, and so it would be sort of building on those existing programs, and yeah, and I think in the end, taking that information that you have on the existing programs and weighing sort of how effective those existing programs with what you think you could achieve with other types of programs or other new programs that are being proposed is an important consideration. But certainly sort of the one-time nature of a lot of these existing programs and a lot of the programs that are on the table and the ability to just use sort of one-time grant funds is something that we think the legislature should consider when thinking about its sort of long-term funding plan and its plan for this year.
Thank you. Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So talking again about the declining revenues and in the forecast, and following up on the Chair's question, in the revenue forecast, you're assuming that the price per ton set at auction is going to continue to be close to the price floor. But as the cap comes down, one would expect that the price per ton would go up at auction. So why are you assuming that it's going to stay close to the price floor? Why wouldn't it go up?
I mean, it could go up. I mean, I think one potential explanation for it not going up is that the allowances that you purchase now can be used in the future as well. And so I think in theory there's an argument that the current allowance price sort of builds those expectations about the cap declining in the future, and that people or different entities can think about purchasing allowances now and using them in the future. And so that allowance price might reflect sort of expectations about the cap declining and affect the demand and purchases for those allowances. So I think that's one issue to sort of keep in mind, and perhaps one explanation for why the current price might reflect sort of what happens in the future, because it reflects sort of market expectations about what would happen in the future and what's needed in the future.
All right, so if I'm understanding what you're saying that if the experts' expectation was that prices were going to go up. People, as an arbitrage, would be buying extra allowances now as a hedge against the price going up in the future, and they aren't. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, and I think that's one explanation. I mean, I do want to note that this is a complicated, and there are probably a lot of different factors that are going into those types of decisions about behavior and purchasing allowances. But I think that's one explanation for why the current allowance price might be a reflection of what allowance prices are in the future. But I don't want to claim that I would know, or our office would know exactly what future allowance prices will be, because it'll depend on a lot of different factors.